Chapter 13. The sequel of my resolution. For anything I know, I may have had some wild idea of running all the way to Dover when I gave up the pursuit of the young man with the donkey cart and started for Greenwich. My scattered senses were soon collected as to that point, if I had, for I came to a stop in the Kent road at a terrace with a piece of water before it, and a great foolish image in the middle, blowing a dry shell. Here I sat down on a doorstep, quite spent and exhausted with the efforts I had already made, and with hardly breath enough to cry for the loss of my box and half-guinea. It was by this time I heard the clocks strike 10 as I sat resting, but it was a summer night, fortunately, and fine weather. When I had recovered my breath and had got rid of a stifling sensation in my throat, I rose up and went on. In the midst of my distress, I had no notion of going back. I doubt if I should have had any, though there had been a Swiss snowdrift in the Kent road. But my standing possessed of only 3 halfpence in the world, and I am sure I wonder how they came to be left in my pocket on a Saturday night, troubled me none the less because I went on. I began to picture to myself as a scrap of newspaper intelligence my being found dead in a day or two under some hedge, and I trudged on miserably, though as fast as I could, until I happened to pass a little shop where it was written up that ladies' and gentlemen's wardrobes were bought, and that the best price was given for rags, bones, and kitchen stuff. The master of this shop was sitting at the door in his shirt sleeves, smoking, and as there were a great many coats and pairs of trousers dangling from the low ceiling, and only 2 feeble candles burning inside to show what they were, I fancied that he looked like a man of a revengeful disposition, who had hung all his enemies and was enjoying himself. My late experiences with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber suggested to me that here might be a means of keeping off the wolf for a little while. I went up the next by-street, took off my waistcoat, rolled it neatly under my arm, and came to the shop door. "If you please, sir," I said, "I am to sell this for a fair price." Mr. Deloby was the name over the shop door at least, took the waistcoat, stood his pipe on its head against the doorpost, went into the shop, followed by me, snuffed the 2 candles with his fingers, spread the waistcoat on the counter and looked at it there, held it up against the light and looked at it there, and ultimately said, "What do you call a price now for this here little waistcoat?" "Oh, you know best, sir," I returned modestly. "I can't be buyer and seller too," said Mr. Deloby. "Put a price on this here little waistcoat." "Would 18 pence be?" I hinted after some hesitation. Mr. Deloby rolled it up again and gave it me back. "I should rob my family," he said, "if I was to offer 9 pence for it." This was a disagreeable way of putting the business, because it imposed upon me, a perfect stranger, the unpleasantness of asking Mr. Deloby to rob his family on my account. My circumstances being so very pressing, however, I said I would take 9 pence for it, if he pleased. Mr. Deloby, not without some grumbling, gave 9 pence. I wished him good night, and walked out of the shop, the richer by that sum, and the poorer by a waistcoat. But when I buttoned my jacket, that was not much. Indeed, I foresaw pretty clearly that my jacket would go next, and that I should have to make the best of my way to Dover in a shirt and a pair of trousers, and might deem myself lucky if I got there even in that trim. But my mind did not run so much on this as might be supposed. Beyond a general impression of the distance before me, and of the young man with the donkey cart having used me cruelly, I think I had no very urgent sense of my difficulties when I once again set off with my 9 pence in my pocket. A plan had occurred to me for passing the night, which I was going to carry into execution. This was to lie behind the wall at the back of my old school, in a corner where there used to be a haystack. I imagined it would be a kind of company to have the boys and the bedroom where I used to tell the stories so near me, although the boys would know nothing of my being there, and the bedroom would yield to me no shelter. I had had a hard day's work, and was pretty well jaded when I came climbing out at last upon the level of Black Heath. It cost me some trouble to find out Salem House, but I found it, and found a haystack in the corner, and I lay down by it, having first walked round the wall and looked up at the windows, and never seen that all was dark and silent within. Never shall I forget the lonely sensation of first lying down without a roof above my head. Sleep came upon me, as it came on many other outcasts, against whom house doors were locked and house dogs were barked that night, and I dreamed of lying on my old school bed, talking to the boys in my room, and found myself sitting upright with Steerforth's name upon my lips, looking wildly up at the stars that were glistening and glimmering above me. When I remembered where I was at that untimely hour, a feeling stole upon me that made me get up, afraid of I don't know what, and walk about. But the fainter glimmering of the stars and the pale light in the sky, where the day was coming, reassured me, and my eyes being very heavy, I lay down again and slept, though with the knowledge in my sleep that it was cold, until the warm beams of the sun and the ringing of the getting up bell at Salem House awoke me. If I could have hoped that Steerforth was there, I would have lurked about until he came out alone, but I knew he must have left long since. Traddles still remained, perhaps, but it was very doubtful, and I had not sufficient confidence in his discretion or good luck, however strong my reliance was on his good nature, to wish to trust him with my situation. So I crept away from the wall as Mr. Creakle's boys were getting up, and struck into the long dusty track which I had first known to be the Dover Road when I was one of them, and when I little expected that any eyes would ever see me the wayfarer I was now upon it. What a different Sunday morning from the old Sunday morning at Yarmouth! In due time I heard the church bells ringing as I plodded on, and I met people who were going to church, and I passed a church or two where the congregation were inside, and the sound of singing came out into the sunshine while the beadle sat and cooled himself in the shade of the porch or stood beneath the yew tree with his hand to his forehead, glowering at me going by. But the peace and rest of the old Sunday morning were on everything except me. That was the difference. I felt quite wicked in my dirt and dust with my tangled hair, but for the quiet picture I had conjured up of my mother in her youth and beauty, weeping by the fire, and my aunt relenting to her, I hardly think I should have had the courage to go on until the next day. But it always went before me, and I followed. I got, that Sunday, through 23 miles on the straight road, though not very easily, for I was new to that kind of toil. I see myself, as evening closes in, coming over the bridge at Rochester, footsore and tired, and eating bread that I had bought for supper. One or two little houses with the notice "Lodgings for Travellers" hanging out had tempted me, but I was afraid of spending the few pence I had, and was even more afraid of the vicious looks of the trampers I had met or overtaken. I sought no shelter, therefore, but the sky, and toiling into Chatham, which in that night's aspect is a mere dream of chalk and drawbridges, and mastless ships in a muddy river, roofed like Noah's arks, crept at last upon a sort of grass-grown battery overhanging a lane, where a sentry was walking to and fro. Here I lay down near a cannon, and happy in the society of the sentry's footsteps, though he knew no more of my being above him than the boys at Salem House had known of my lying by the wall, slept soundly until morning. Very stiff and sore of foot I was in the morning, and quite dazed by the beating of drums and marching of troops, which seemed to hem me on every side when I went down towards the long narrow street. Feeling that I could go but a very little way that day, if I were to reserve any strength for getting to my journey's end, I resolved to make the sale of my jacket its principal business. Accordingly, I took the jacket off that I might learn to do without it, and carrying it under my arm, began a tour of inspection of the various slop shops. It was a likely place to sell a jacket in, for the dealers in second-hand clothes were numerous and were, generally speaking, on the lookout for customers at their shop doors. But, as most of them had hanging up among their stock an officer's coat or two, epaulets and all, I was rendered timid by the costly nature of their dealings, and walked about for a long time without offering my merchandise to anyone. The modesty of mind directed my attention to the marine store shops, and such shops as Mr. Dolloby's in preference to the regular dealers. At last, I found one that I thought looked promising at the corner of a dirty lane, ending in an enclosure full of stinging nettles, against the palings of which some second-hand sailors' clothes that seemed to have overflowed the shop were fluttering among some cots, and rusty guns and oilskin hats, and certain trays full of so many old rusty keys of so many sizes that they seemed various enough to open all the doors in the world. Into this shop, which was low and small, and which was darkened rather than lighted by a little window, overhung with clothes, and was descended into by some steps, I went with a palpitating heart, which was not relieved when an ugly old man, with the lower part of his face all covered with a stubbly grey beard, rushed out of a dirty den behind it, and seized me by the hair of my head. He was a dreadful old man to look at, in a filthy flannel waistcoat, and smelling terribly of rum. His bedstead, covered with a tumbled and ragged piece of patchwork, was in the den he had come from, where another little window showed a prospect of more stinging nettles and a lame donkey. "Oh, what do you want?" grinned this old man in a fierce, monotonous whine. "Oh, my eyes and limbs, what do you want? Oh, my lungs and liver, what do you want? Oh, garoo, garoo." I was so much dismayed by these words, and particularly by the repetition of the last unknown one, which was a kind of rattle in his throat, that I could make no answer. Hereupon the old man, still holding me by the hair, repeated, "Oh, what do you want? Oh, my eyes and limbs, what do you want? Oh, my lungs and liver, what do you want? Oh, garoo," which he screwed out of himself with an energy that made his eyes start in his head. "I wanted to know," I said, trembling, "if you would buy a jacket." "Oh, let's see the jacket," cried the old man. "Oh, my heart on fire, show the jacket to us. Oh, my eyes and limbs, bring the jacket out." With that, he took his trembling hands, which were like the claws of a great bird, out of my hair, and put on a pair of spectacles not at all ornamental to his inflamed eyes. "Oh, how much for the jacket?" cried the old man, after examining it. "Oh, garoo, how much for the jacket?" "half-a-crown," I answered, recovering myself. "Oh, my lungs and liver," cried the old man. "No. Oh, my eyes, no. Oh, my limbs, no. 18 pence, garoo." Every time he uttered this ejaculation, his eyes seemed to be in danger of starting out. At every sentence he spoke, he delivered in a sort of tune, always exactly the same, and more like a gust of wind, which begins low, mounts up high, and falls again, than any other comparison I can find for it. "Well," said I, glad to have closed the bargain, "I'll take 18 pence." "Oh, my liver," cried the old man, throwing the jacket on a shelf. "Get out of the shop. Oh, my lungs, get out of the shop. Oh, my eyes and limbs, Guru. Don't ask for money. Make it an exchange. I never was so frightened in my life, before or since, but I told him humbly that I wanted money, and that nothing else was of any use to me, but that I would wait for it, as he desired outside, and had no wish to hurry him. So I went outside, and sat down in the shade in a corner, and I sat there so many hours that the shade became sunlight, and the sunlight became shade again, and still I sat there waiting for the money. There never was such another drunken madman in that line of business, I hope. That he was well known in the neighbourhood and enjoyed the reputation of having sold himself to the devil, I soon understood from the visits he received from the boys who continually came skirmishing about the shop, shouting that legend and calling to him to bring out his gold. You ain't poor, you know, Charlie, as you pretend. Bring out your gold. Bring out some of the gold you sold yourself to the devil for. Come, it's in the lining of the mattress, Charlie. Rip it open and let's have some. This, and many offers to lend him a knife for the purpose, exasperated him to such a degree that the whole day was a succession of rushes on his part and flights on the part of the boys. Sometimes, in his rage, he would take me for one of them and come at me, mouthing as if he were going to tear me in pieces, then remembering me just in time, would dive into the shop and lie upon his bed, as I thought from the sound of his voice, yelling in a frantic way, to his own windy tune, the death of Nelson, with an "oh" before every line, and innumerable gurus interspersed. As if this were not bad enough for me, the boys, connecting me with the establishment on account of the patience and perseverance with which I sat outside, half dressed, pelted me, and used me very ill all day. He made many attempts to induce me to consent to an exchange, at one time coming out with a fishing rod, at another with a fiddle, at another with a cocked hat, at another with a flute, but I resisted all these overtures and sat there in desperation, each time asking him with tears in my eyes for my money or my jacket. At last he began to pay me in halfpence at a time, and was full 2 hours getting by easy stages to a shilling. Oh, my eyes and limbs, he then cried, peeping hideously out of the shop after a long pause. Will you go for 2 pence more? I can't, I said. I shall be starved. Oh, my lungs and liver, will you go for 3 pence? I would go for nothing if I could, I said, but I want the money badly. No, Guru. It is really impossible to express how he twisted this ejaculation out of himself as he peeped round the doorpost at me, showing nothing but his crafty old head. Will you go for 4 pence? I was so faint and weary that I closed with this offer, and taking the money out of his claw, not without trembling, went away more hungry and thirsty than I had ever been a little before sunset. But at an expense of 3 pence, I soon refreshed myself completely, and, being in better spirits then, limped 7 miles upon my road. My bed at night was under another haystack, where I rested comfortably after having washed my blistered feet in a stream and dressed them as well as I was able with some cool leaves. When I took the road again next morning, I found that it lay through a succession of hop grounds and orchards. It was sufficiently late in the year for the orchards to be ruddy with ripe apples, and in a few places the hop pickers were already at work. I thought it all extremely beautiful, and made up my mind to sleep among the hops that night, imagining some cheerful companionship in the long perspectives of poles with the graceful leaves twining round them. The trampers were worse than ever that day, and inspired me with a dread that it is yet quite fresh in my mind. Some of them were most ferocious looking ruffians, who stared at me as I went by, and stopped, perhaps, and called after me to come back and speak to them, and, when I took to my heels, stoned me. I recollect one young fellow, a tinker, I suppose, from his wallet and brassiere, who had a woman with him, and who faced about and stared at me thus, and then roared to me in such a tremendous voice to come back that I halted and looked round. "Come here when you're called," said the tinker, "or I'll rip your young body open." I thought it best to go back as I drew nearer to them, trying to propitiate the tinker by my looks. I observed that the woman had a black eye. "Where are you going?" said the tinker, gripping the bosom of my shirt with his blackened hand. "I'm going to Dover," I said. "Where do you come from?" asked the tinker, giving his hand another turn in my shirt to hold me more securely. "I come from London," I said. "What lay are you upon?" asked the tinker. "Are you a prig?" "No, no," I said. "Ain't you bags?" "If you make a brag of your honesty to me," said the tinker, "I'll knock your brains out." With his disengaged hand, he made a menace of striking me and then looked at me from head to foot. "Have you got the price of a pint of beer about you?" said the tinker. "If you have, out with it, afore I take it away." I should certainly have produced it, but that I met the woman's look and saw her very slightly shake her head and form no with her lips. "I am very poor," I said, attempting to smile, "and I've got no money." "Why, what do you mean?" said the tinker, looking so sternly at me that I almost feared he saw the money in my pocket. "Sir," I stammered, "what what do you mean," said the tinker, "by wearing my brother's silk handkerchief? Give it over here." And he had mine off my neck in a moment, and tossed it to the woman. The woman burst into a fit of laughter, as if she thought this a joke, and tossed it back to me, nodded once, as slightly as before, and made the word "go" with her lips, before I could obey. However, the tinker seized the handkerchief out of my hand with a roughness that threw me away like a feather, and putting it loosely round his own neck, turned upon the woman with an oath, and knocked her down. I never shall forget seeing her fall backwards on the hard road, and lie there with her bonnet tumbled off, and her hair all whitened in the dust, nor, when I looked back from a distance, seeing her sitting on the pathway, which was a bank by the roadside, wiping the blood from her face with the corner of her shawl, while he went on ahead. This adventure frightened me so that afterwards, when I saw any of these people coming, I turned back until I could find a hiding place where I remained until they had gone out of sight, which happened so often that I was very seriously delayed. But under this difficulty, as under all the other difficulties of my journey, I seemed to be sustained and led on by my fanciful picture of my mother in her youth before I came into the world. It always kept me company. It was there among the hops when I lay down to sleep. It was with me on my waking in the morning. It went before me all day. I have associated it, ever since, with the sunny street of Canterbury, dozing, as it were, in the hot light, and with the sight of its old houses and gateways, and the stately grey cathedral with the rooks sailing round the towers. When I came, at last, upon the bare, wide downs near Dover, it relieved the solitary aspect of the scene with hope, and not until I reached that first great aim of my journey, and actually set foot in the town itself on the 6th day of my flight, did it desert me. But then, strange to say, when I stood with my ragged shoes and my dusty, sunburnt, half-clothed figure in the place so long desired, it seemed to vanish like a dream, and to leave me helpless and dispirited. I inquired about my aunt among the boatmen first, and received various answers. One said she lived in the South Foreland Light, and had singed her whiskers rather, by doing so. Another, that she was made fast to the great buoy outside the harbour, and could only be visited at half-tide. A third, that she was locked up in Maidstone jail for child-stealing. A fourth, that she was seen to mount a broom in the last high wind, and make direct for Calais. The fly-drivers, among whom I inquired next, were equally jocose and equally disrespectful. and the shopkeepers, not liking my appearance, generally replied without hearing what I had to say that they had got nothing for me. I felt more miserable and destitute than I had done at any period of my running away. My money was all gone. I had nothing left to dispose of. I was hungry, thirsty, and worn out, and seemed as distant from my end as if I had remained in London. The morning had worn away in these inquiries, and I was sitting on the step of an empty shop at a street corner near the marketplace, deliberating upon wandering towards those other places which had been mentioned when a fly driver, coming by with his carriage, dropped a horsecloth. Something good-natured in the man's face, as I handed it up, encouraged me to ask him if could tell me where Miss Trotwood lived, though I had asked the question so often that it almost died upon my lips. "Trotwood," said he. "Let me see. I know the name too. Old lady?" Yes," I said, rather. "Pretty stiff in the back," said he, making himself upright. "Yes," I said. "I should think it very likely." "Carries a bag?" said he. "Bag with a good deal of room in it, is gruffish, and comes down upon you sharp." My heart sank within me as I acknowledged the undoubted accuracy of this description. "Why, then, I tell you what," said he. "If you go up there," pointing with his whip towards the heights, "and keep right on till you come to some houses facing the sea, I think you'll hear of her. My opinion is, she won't stand anything, so here's a penny for you." I accepted the gift thankfully, and bought a loaf with it. Dispatching this refreshment by the way, I went in the direction my friend had indicated, and walked on a good distance without coming to the houses he had mentioned. At length I saw some before me, and approaching them, went into a little shop. It was what we used to call a general shop at home, and inquired if they could have the goodness to tell me where Miss Trotwood lived. I addressed myself to a man behind the counter who was weighing some rice for a young woman, but the latter, taking the inquiry to herself, turned round quickly. "My mistress?" she said. "What do you want with her, boy?" "I want," I replied, "to speak to her, if you please." "To beg of her, you mean?" retorted the damsel. "No," I said, "indeed," but suddenly remembering that in truth I came for no other purpose, I held my peace in confusion, and felt my face burn. My aunt's handmaid, as I suppose she was from what she had said, put her rice in a little basket, and walked out of the shop, telling me that I could follow her if I wanted to know where Miss Trotwood lived. I needed no second permission, though I was by this time in such a state of consternation and agitation that my legs shook under me. I followed the young woman, and we soon came to a very neat little cottage with cheerful bow windows. In front of it, a small square gravelled court or garden full of flowers, carefully tended and smelling deliciously.